Okay, so I'm back. I crashed my GPU last night, which is why the screencasting stopped. And the reason that happened was, as we were in the terrain on the painting detail editor, and I was adding all these meshes. I'd gone into the bushes and I was starting to paint away, and I wasn't seeing anything, and it's because of the level of detail. So we kind of briefly talked about that. Say in the trees, if you select one of the tree assets, you notice that lot 0, lot 1, 2, and that's a level of detail. If your distance from the object is up to this breakpoint, then you'll get 100% of the geometry, then 50% of the geometry. Billboarding eventually, which is just a flat image, and then it gets culled, so it disappears. So we're really far away from the actual terrain, the surface of the terrain, and so I was adding lots of geometry, not seeing it because I wasn't close enough to it, and eventually, just when I started zooming in, it kind of crashed everything. So it's well worth kind of bearing in mind. Also, generally speaking, these imported assets aren't optimized at all, and I usually wouldn't just be throwing in, certainly not these bushes, via the paint detail editor. I would usually do that by hand, and we can do that in a bit. But what you do use that editor for is often just adding a grass texture, and that geometry for that is very simple. It's just essentially a flat billboard. So let's open that up, and there are a couple of grass types that you can choose. I'm just going to select that one. For now I'll keep it to the default, but you'll see why you probably want to change that. So here I am clicking away, I'm not seeing anything yet. So until I zoom in, try to see, I'm probably somewhere there. So if I'm clicking now, you can see suddenly, so if I zoom out, the level of detail makes it disappear, and then move back in. So there it is. And just be super careful, we're adding stuff which we're not really seeing the scale of, and it's probably now time to start getting somebody down in here, getting our player down in there and getting a feel for actually what things look like. And just while I'm here, I'm just going to add one of these bushes as well, so that you can see the geometry that's involved, and so that we can see how it feels. So get a character, and we imported as part of our standard assets, we had characters. You could choose a first person character. I'm just going to go with one of the third person characters, and get into the folder called Prefabs. Okay, what's a prefab in Unity? Unity uses prefabs for a lot of things. They're kind of prefabricated game objects. So your game objects, when they appear black in the scene, they're just game objects. You've created them maybe on the fly through here. When they're blue, it means that they actually exist in your project and there's a master copy of it. So that bush is a good example. If I select it in the hierarchy and look at its inspector, I can see it's a prefab, it's blue, and also get this option to select the prefab. It takes me to its location in the project. You can make changes from the prefab are shown in kind of bold black letters. So its original position, if I selected it, is the world origin 000, but in our scene it's at 56,060. What's useful about prefabs is if you change just that one prefab in the project window, it changes all instances of it in the scene and across all scenes that prefab is used. So let's get an example of that. I'll just select that and I'm clicking Control D to duplicate. Just going to move to my move tool. So I've now got Control D again. I've now got 3 bushes. Now I can choose to change it in here. By the way, really useful keyboard shortcuts. W is for the move tool, E rotate, R for scale. So it just makes it easier to just change what you need. So if I undo that scale, so for example, I wanted to scale all of those bushes all at once, I can just click on the prefab and then scale it in there and make them all smaller, and you can see that's actually affecting all of the objects in the scene. Let me make that kind of more even, 2 and 2, and actually I have a feeling that that's the height that they're meant to be. I seem to remember that the prefabs themselves are too large in scale, and we'll get to that when we throw in our character. So yeah, so I've kind of talked about prefabs, and I guess while I'm here also I'll talk a little bit about organizing what's going on in here, because you'll be used to folders for organizing things in your project. One of the things you can do is, if I'm right clicking, create empty, create an empty object, and it's a good habit to just reset it so it's all zeroed out. And let's say it's called that bushes. Now I can click on each bush and then just drag it into my empty game object. Everything in here, I can't remember if I mentioned it yesterday, but everything in the scene view is a game object. So I've clicked the prefabs of the bush, the instances of the prefab in the project, and I'm just organizing them. It's a bit like creating folders, and it means that you can then select it in one go, make changes to it in one go, and it just keeps also your scene a little bit neater. So the kind of thing you might do, again, reset it, might call that environment. Actually plus probably not a great idea. Move my bushes in there, and then I might add some rocks. So look, usually it's a good idea to look for prefabs if you're downloading assets. Oh, and by the way, if you're wanting to make a prefab, so for example, let's not make it an empty, let's make a whatever, a sphere. Bring it a bit closer. So if you want to make that sphere, which is just a normal game object, or you could do a kind of a more than one, so you could do one that's big and one small, and I could then group them. Spheres. So I've now got a parent game object with children, and I can pick that up, drag them essentially where I want. I guess let me do this properly. The way I would usually do it would be I would create a folder called prefabs and then drag that into my prefabs folder. Now you can see I've created a prefab that's turned blue. I can drag in more instances of that prefab. I don't think I zeroed out my thing. Oh no, actually I did zero it out, so it's kind of zeroed to the global center. So remember about that. The actual location of, so yeah, I'm moving the center of the object. So something worth bearing in mind when you're kind of nesting game objects. Your pivot could end up not quite where you expect it. So I guess if you wanted to, you could then click on those, and so these, yeah, this is a useful kind of little trick as well. You can, if you click on the middle one, it'll go into kind of a flat orthographic view, and if you click on it again, it flicks to a perspective view. The errors in the console are to do with the camera frustum. It's just not able to render everything in its view, and it's kind of, we're going down in kind of weird angles. You can pretty much safely ignore those ones. They might pop up at various stages, but So clicking on the pivots, I can, in the center, I can change from a flat view, which is where it seems to kind of throw the frustum of the camera, to a perspective view, and this is really good for placement. Then you can click on each one of these axes to look essentially from those perspectives. If I want to look from the top, click on the Y, zoom out. So this is a flat view from the top, which is a good way to kind of place things. Similarly from the Z or X axis, and then you may decide to actually do your work more in a perspective mode in using these. So yeah, it's kind of a bit of a sideline, but worth knowing about. Let me clear that console. So I'll delete that, and just so you can see where the pivot is. If I go in just to prove my point about the prefabs, I can then change what's going on in here. Make any changes I make affects both. Right, let me delete that and get back. Delete the prefabs here. Can't undo. Actually, you can if you go into your Windows delete directory or restore from delete. It will come back in. These are just real files. They do exist in your. Let me show you. Show in Explorer. So that is a file. So if when I click delete in here, it goes to your delete folder. It's worth knowing. Sometimes it kind of saves you having to recreate things. But anyway, so yeah, so there's our dummy prefab gone. So we started doing our environment. We're going to throw in a character, third person, and go into the prefab. So there are models. The model of our character is just a mesh, but the prefab comes with not just the transform, but also an animator, a rigid body which turns on the physics engine, a capsule collider so that it responds to collisions, component that takes in user control, i.e. your input mouse, and the third person character script. The component essentially translates information from the input control and tells the animator what to do, and tells the transform what to do, i.e. move, animate legs. So it's just going to drag. You can drag it into the hierarchy, or you can drag it into the scene and place it directly, and immediately you can see, whoa, he seems tiny by comparison. Our grass is way too big, and but it's actually that our scale is wrong. So it's really good practice to get your character in pretty quickly, or have, like I did earlier on, have a 1 meter block cube that just is your reference as you're building these things. So let's do a little bit of fixing before we go any further. Clicking the terrain again, the textures. So the grass is, again, just edit texture. Its scale is wrong. I'm just going to make that way smaller. I'm affecting at the moment just one of the textures. It's obviously not the one that's here, so I'm just going to go on to the next one. Edit texture. That looks better. So that's starting to look more like you'd expect, and just to keep everything to the right scale, let's do that one as well. Okay, that's better. Next up, the grass. So edit details, edit, and you've got maximum width, actually, or min width, and I'll leave it at that. You can tweak your own as you want. I mean, there are ways of making this grass look better. It is just a very billboardy technique, quite common in games, I guess. But in-game itself, it doesn't quite look so bad as in the scene view, but just, yeah, there are ways of making it look better when you get into that kind of thing. So we got a little bit of a scene going on. We've got a character, but what we haven't really looked at yet is the camera. So if I select our main camera, you can see a preview, and it's just pointing generally at just the world origin. And I guess if I press play now, play goes obviously into play mode. Your scene window is still active. You can click back to it, but it automatically switches you to game view. And yes, I've got, all I'm seeing is a stationary camera looking at where it's looking at. Little tricks with camera: if you've got a nice view that you like, when it's selected, you can go into game object, align with view, so align this game object with the current view in the scene, and you can see that's changed what you're seeing in the camera. It's not perfect because of the perspective, but it often gets you in kind of close enough, you know, if that's what the kind of thing that you're looking. So there you are, there's the kind of what we're looking at. But actually what I think we need is more of a third person view, so let's align here, game object, align with view, so now we're a bit better, moving a bit closer possibly. Good. Now I press play, and I'm just using the WASD keys. That's what's mapped inside. So this third person user control. So it's moving our character, but the camera is not going anywhere. And the reason for that is just a game object. There's nothing special about it. There's no animation on it, in the same way that the third person controller has got its component, the third person character component, which is making the animator and the transform change depending on input. So the dead easy way of changing that is, we talked about these parents and children, is literally you can make the camera a child of the transform of the third person controller. So now if I go into play mode and I play, as I'm moving around, you literally have the camera, just because it's childed to this game object, and the game object is moving as I'm adding input through my keys. Yeah, you've got kind of a very basic third person camera, I guess. There are other ways of doing it. So another way would be to use some of the cameras that we brought in. So you want something that's a bit better. So they've got a multi-purpose camera rig. Drag and drop that, and then just gonna right click on here, copy the component, and select this and right click and paste component values. That's a good way of copying over the transform values, but actually you can do it with any component. If the components are the same, it'll copy those values from one to the other. So I've done that onto the multi-purpose camera rig. I'm just going to disable the main camera. That little tick box is whether a component, a game object in the hierarchy is active or not. Let me give you an example of that. So for example, if I throw in some rocks, well, that's not quite the kind of rock I'm looking for. I think that's a huge one. Yeah, and it's huge, and also it has no back faces, which is why we can see through the geometry. If I turn it around, you can see it's been made to be essentially a huge wall. So no, it's not what I'm looking for. Let me just drop a slightly smaller rock. Oh, here's a nice trick for moving around the scene. So I'm right clicking, my cursor's changing to an eye, and then I'm using WASD, and it's a kind of a flying camera through the space. It's kind of useful to get around. So yeah, so I've got a rock, which is a game object. You can deselect it, it makes it disappear in the scene view, obviously also in the game, but it's still there, it's just inactive. And you can use scripts to activate and deactivate. The code is enabled or set active, and yeah, so that's essentially what I've done with the camera. I'll leave that rock. I'll leave that rock in there. I might just move it out of the way and make it a little bit bigger. Maybe turn it around and just then Control D just to make a. So here's a good kind of instance of how you can use just the same mesh but in a few clever ways. And oh yeah, so there's that. The axis is kind of looking weird, and it's because we're looking at its local axis. So I've touched on this before. It wasn't so obvious when we were dealing with the cube, but now it's pretty apparent. Actually, I want to move it down onto the ground according to the global world axis, not its local axis. So I flick that over to global, and now that Y is this Y, and I can just drop it down more easily. So, right. We had a main camera, we've disabled it. We've brought in a multi-purpose camera. I'm going to move these rocks into the environment just to make things a bit neater. This is a prefab. Select it in here, and it comes with a few components, a rigid body because of the movement it's going to be doing. So you'll see it when I run it. It's got a kind of, it needs a physics engine to make it move around. It also has the potential to detect collisions. That's currently disabled, so this script will not have any effect. If you choose to enable that functionality, you need to tick that. But I just keep it at its default. And the one thing it is looking for is a target. So it's a camera that essentially will move in on whatever we choose. By default, I guess, for a third-person camera, we want it to target the player, and you can either drag and drop the our character into the target slot of that script. Selected it in the hierarchy and then just dragged and dropped, and it's black because that's not affecting the prefab. It's just the instance of the camera rig in the hierarchy. But it also, the camera rig comes with some kind of a pre-auto target player that's going to tick, and well, that's going to be looking for, I guess I can open the script, give you a quick peek at it. So it's actually extending from the pivot based camera rig, so that's why I'm not seeing the I guess you know more about this kind of stuff. I can go to the declaration, there's the target, and that's the abstract target follow, so I can go to that declaration. Here we go, M target, and if auto target player, finding target player, so go to declaration, here it is, and what it's actually going to set that target to a game object, find object with tag, player, tags. Up here in the inspector, so any game object can be tagged with a string. There are a few that come already predefined. Main camera is one of them, player is another, our character controller hasn't yet been tagged with that. It's untagged, but I just click on that, you'll see it in the list, and you can add your own. You could add a tag, little plus, and say, I don't know, enemy would be a common tag that you might add to other characters in the scene, and then you can use that find object with tag to just pick up all the enemies, for example. But in our case, with the multi-purpose camera, what it's doing here with the auto target, so it doesn't need the target to be dropped in, because it's going to look in the scene for any game object that has the player tag. Tags can be useful, but they're also they're not very robust. So you end up with these problems of potentially another object in the scene has got a player tag on it. There are no restrictions to that, so I'd be careful about just relying on those all the time, which is partly why I've just got into the habit of you just drag and drop your target. If you know that's the target that you want, then just stick with it. Okay, so now we've pressed play. Now we're using the multi-purpose camera rig instead of the child camera which we had earlier on, and it's not perfect, but it's just a little bit smoother. You can see the kind of the rotation is lerped. It's kind of slowly moving from one speed to the other. This camera doesn't have a mouse orbit. You can find them. There are a few on the Asset store, some free ones, some paid ones, so I'll let you kind of look around if that's the kind of camera controller that you're looking for, but for now this will kind of do the trick. So if I stop, actually something that's worth talking about is this play mode. So if I go into play mode, let me go and see if I can, so go next to our rocks. Any changes that you make during in play mode are not saved, and it's just worth remembering that, because it's easy to go into play mode, do lots of changes in here, because things are still editable. So for example, especially if you're working with more than one monitor and you're kind of got the play the game window open in one and also the scene, and you start kind of doing, right, I'm gonna select that, and actually I want it to be bigger. As soon as I leave play mode, everything goes back to the state that it was at before you entered play mode. So yeah, just watch out for that. And some people like to change the color of their editor, which you can do in I think it's in preferences somewhere. Look it up. Oh no, yeah, there it is. So scene view, you can give the background different colors in different play mode tint. There you are. So you can say, actually, when I'm in play mode, I want it to be completely red, and that's a really strong warning that any changes that you make will be lost. I'm just gonna go back to what I had. That's a bit it's a bit full on. Preferences, colors, play mode tint. It's good to have some tint, but let's not go crazy. Right, we've got a player. You could play around a little bit more with the scaling of the grass, but now you get a better feel for how you might create an environment. Talked about organizing things. I think possibly the lights. So the lighting in Unity is I guess it's pretty self-explanatory. You can have different types of light. Press F. There's my this directional light. By default, you get a directional light setup, which is essentially the sun, and slightly weirdly that its position, because it's the sun, it's such a large object, doesn't actually matter. You can place it wherever you want. But what does matter with the sun is its orientation, and its orientation will dictate the time of day. So you can imagine adding a script to the sun and just change its orientation on the x-axis, and that would give you a day-night cycle, for example. Hand in hand with the sun lighting, if I go into the lighting tab, is how the sky is represented. So again, by default you've got this sky box, which is this default sky box here. You can actually have no sky box. You end up with a flat, whatever color sky you pick. Kind of worth noting, so I'm changing blue. The sky is not changing blue, and that's because there is no sky, but the ambient color of the sky is blue, and you can see that tint on the foliage. If you do want a blue sky, you have to actually go into the main camera and back to the inspector, and this is the color of the sky. So it's not, we would say, no, it's not the sky box, and now I want my my camera to see it's just a solid color, and it's got an alpha of 0, but as I bring it up, depth only. No idea why that's not changing. I'm sure there's a good reason. See if that would work with that one. Disable. Ah, do we have to be in game mode? Yeah, sorry, just being stupid. So I've disabled both cameras, so it's got no rendering whatsoever. Turn it back on. Play. There's my blue sky. We're rendering as opposed to looking at things in scene view, which has no background material, no sky. So let's put things back. Inspector. Actually, that can be pretty much anywhere you want if you're going to use a skybox, which we are. So I think I gave you a second set of resources. I actually ended up finding a half decent skybox. A skybox is a material. I select it, then look at the inspector. You can see it literally is a box with a back, left, right, up, down faces, like a cube, and it's all put together into a kind of a rendered sky. You can change its exposure, make things brighter or less bright, and its rotation, and I guess where it would be useful to change the orientation was to fit that sunspot on the skybox to fit with how you've placed your directional light, your sun, in the sky. So let's grab that and put it in, and I'll go back here. So I've got now, yeah, the sky, and trying to see where our sun is coming from. So I might change the rotation of the sun to make it fit in a bit more with the lighting. But I can see that, yeah, the shadows coming in from over there. So really, the sun should be coming from. Yeah, I mean, I'll let you. That feels more natural. So I've just kind of rotated it, and I think I've probably gone a bit too dark on the light. So change the time of day a bit. Oh, actually, let's go crazy. So it's night time, more or less. Let's get some more lights in. Right click, lights. So we've done directional light. You can have more than one directional light, more than one sun, but kind of can play a little bit havoc with your lighting. Other kinds of lightings like point lights. So if I move it closer to our player, maybe by these rocks, yeah, F to get just in a bit closer, and you can see it's kind of hot spot. You can increase the range, make it tiny or big, and you can change its intensity, so how bright it is. So there's a kind of an interplay between range and intensity, and obviously you can change its color. So up to you. And then other kind of lights, spotlights. Area lights are quite interesting. You can only bake an area light. Just do a spotlight, move it so you see it. I mean, that's kind of what you would expect, you know. We get similarly range and intensity, but you'll notice lights can have one of three modes: real time, which what we're on currently; mixed, which is actually a mixture between real time and the other mode, which is baked. If you're baking your lighting, you're in the baking tab, and you've got either real-time lighting with global illumination, mixed lighting, which is a mixture of the real-time lighting, and light mapping, which is just essentially taking a picture of how each of the textures across the whole of the world are affected by the lights in the scene. So it's good for performance. You don't have real-time lights to calculate as you're running around. It's just a flat record of what's there in the scene. If you're going to use light mapping, I'd probably recommend progressive, which is the new light mapping setting, and it works well. Watch out for auto generate. I think by default that's on, and as soon as it's on, you'll see it kind of chug away. So this notification disappears. You'll see it in the bottom right. It's kind of baking in the background as you're working, and it'll continue to do that. Every time you move an object, it'll rebake in the background, which, unless you're actually using light maps, you probably don't need or don't want. They're super useful. It's something I would recommend looking into for just optimizing performance, but I won't do that certainly not tonight. So we got some lights. The things are kind of okay, but they're looking a little bit flat. And the other thing I mentioned about bringing in was a post-processing stack, and that's just a series of effects. And the way that you add them on your camera. So if you're using the camera rig, it's actually is the camera that you want. It's the game object with a camera component. Click on add component, and it's a good opportunity for me to show you what's in the component panel. You can access them from the top left from here as well. You can search by kind of what they are by scripts. Mostly what's currently there are just the default scripts, but your own scripts will start to appear. Camera control exercise of VR stuff, meshes. You can search, or say if you wanted to add, for whatever reason, a box collider, you can start typing box, and you get your what components are available that begin with that keyword. And what we're looking for is the post-processing behavior, and that's a script that's looking for a profile. So it's looking for a template. It's going to run everything from this template, and the templates, actually I can see one from what I was doing last night, are they're not game objects. You can see the actual icon doesn't look like anything else that you probably have seen yet. It's not like a model, it's not like a prefab, or not a material or a terrain. Do we have any scripts? No, not quite yet. Actually, how you would create a script. there. So the C# is the icon for just double clicking and opens Mono Develop. You'll probably want Visual Studio, I expect. So yes, that's the icon for the scripts. But for the post-processing stat profiles, they're using oh, mine's gone blank, scriptable objects. And a scriptable object is not a mono behavior. It's I guess it's a scripted template that is then run through this script, and it'll start making sense, I guess, once we start using it. So just clicked on that. It'll show me ones that are available. So that's the one I did yesterday. Let me just make one from scratch. So probably would go, well, whether in script or go as I did yesterday and just put it in the post-processing folder. Right click in here, create post-processing profile, new profile, and I'll go through this pretty quickly because there's a great video by a YouTuber called Brackies. He does some really good YouTube tutorials, and he runs through that. I think I'll give you the link yesterday, and yeah, he explains every single one of the slots that you can have. Each slot is essentially a different effect. To enable it, so I've created a new profile, click on my camera, there's a post-processing behavior, and just drag and drop, and I've now enabled that profile for that camera. Nothing's changed yet because I guess apart from the fog, which is just on by default. I guess one of the good things about scriptable objects is, unlike the game objects, if I go into play mode, it will remember the changes I've made because it's actually being serialized immediately. It's there. It's in the. It's not live in the scene view, as it were. So you're writing to file as you're making your changes. So that's actually kind of useful when you're doing things like. So ambient occlusion, it just adds this kind of level of detail. You can see how it's adding shadows where it's kind of working out that there's some occlusion between the I mean, I'm really exaggerating stuff. It's often more apparent on things like rocks, but I've lit up my rocks. But yeah, it's a good effect. It's worth using. Depth of field, super useful if you want something that looks a little bit more natural. So if I increase those beyond what you would naturally have, you can see I've got this kind of spot that's in focus, and I can move the focus distance so very close, and I'm just hitting the spot where my player kind of tends to be, and then I can kind of dial that back so it's not quite so. I mean, I'm still going a bit crazy, but and now things that are very close are out of focus, and things that are very far are also out of focus. Motion blur is just if you've turned it on, as you're kind of moving, it just smooths out some of the changes. Bloom's quite common in games. Let's have a look at it. So bloom's really apparent when you look at lights and light sources. See if I slightly change that. Oh, actually no, I should be able to get some bloom. Just by increasing the intensity. So yeah, there you are. So off the rock, it's kind of, again, that's just way too much, but it gives you a feel for what's possible. Color grading, at its most basic, you can change the exposure, but you can go change your black levels. You can start getting a bit more of a kind of a dramatic effect, and you can go crazy and change, like the tint, temperature, you know, entirely up to you. You can go a bit really mad. You can buy profiles, post-processing files, for not very much, like a couple of dollars, and they're useful kind of as just to show you what's possible. So I just do that, and chromatic aberration's pretty cool. You see on the edge of the frame, things are being distorted as they might by a real lens. It's quite a common effect in games, as is a vignette. So that's just adding a kind of a darkness around the edges of the frame. And then if I stop, you'll notice all of my, because we're dealing with a scriptable object, all my changes have been, you know, still there. That's all good. Probably, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Bracky does a really good explanation of dithering, anti-aliasing, camera mode. So currently we're in our render path is set to forward. If I switch over to deferred, you can see the trees are slightly, I guess, more realistically lit. It's taking a different calculation for the path of light rays through the scene. So people will often say, you know, change to deferred, but if you do, then you've got to disable this anti-aliasing, the MSAA anti-aliasing. It's also recommended to turn on HDR so that you're kind of optimizing the lighting, and it's starting to see things just starting to look a little bit more realistic. But having disabled MSA, then you probably want to go into your profile and definitely enable it in here. Possibly also make use of dithering. Dithering would be things like banding in the sky. If that starts to appear, you can use a little bit of dither. Let me just leave it at that. Let's have a quick look on the. Yeah, so I mean, you know, it's not the best. It's not the best scene I've ever made, but you get a feel for what's possible. So we've got real-time lighting, we've done a post-processing stack, but our guy's a little bit all on his own. So just I'll talk briefly about bringing in some AI and pathfinding, so you can get people moving around. So again, there's a character in Prefabs, so there's an AI third-person controller that you can just drag in to use, and it's very similar to that third-person controller. He's got an animator, rigid body, collider, but the extras and what's missing, so it's missing the controller input, which for the third-person controller comes from us. It's a user control that takes input from the keyboard or your you know, kind of Xbox controller, but with the AI, it's being driven not by input but by a nav mesh agent, which in turn runs through the character controller, and then finally the third person character controller is the same as the one, but it's taking that input from nav mesh agent character control and then drives the animator and the transform. But if I press play now, nothing much is going to happen, because in fact it's saying it can't find, it's not been placed on a nav mesh. You're getting lots of errors because the nav mesh agent is going to path find on a navigation mesh, which you need to bake, you need to create it. Let me clear that. So I've moved, we looked briefly at lighting, I've moved to the navigation tab. If I go to bake, then you can choose to bake in here. Before I do that, I guess I should talk about game objects and geometry in general being thought of as static. So by default the terrain will be static. It's the engine's not expecting it to move, so it's going to put it in. It's got this little flag up here at the top. If you click on the arrow, it shows you there are actually different types of static. It's how the engine optimizes things in the background. Things that it knows are not going to move can be batched. So for example, the two rocks that we've got there, best be set as static so that it can be batched into a single object with the same texture and just blitted to the screen in a single draw call. Things can be light map static, so it knows that when you're baking light, so we quickly talked about it in here, when you're baking your light map, it knows that those objects are not going to move, so it can use those objects as part of the light map, and whatever the lighting that is shining on them is not going to change. Other kind of static kind of status, I guess it would be an occlusion static, where you can have an occlusion map that you bake in the same way that you bake a navigation map, and that's helping the engine from not having to draw everything all the time. So if your camera is pointing in one direction, what's going on behind it is out of the frustum, it's out of view of the camera, and so it doesn't need to be rendered. And similarly, if you've got a big house that's occluding what's behind it, then as long as you've baked an occlusion map, then the engine will know, right, don't start rendering things that are behind a static object. It's an occludee. So the way that you would set objects, so some, when you bring them in for assets, they've already been set as static. Pretty sure these rocks aren't. Yeah, so they haven't, and they're a really good case of they should be set as static. So you could choose to do each one individually. You might decide it should be batch static, but actually not navigation static, and the reason for that is once you make something that's navigation static, you'll see it when I bake the nav mesh. If something is navigation static, it's taken into consideration for the pathfinding. You would want that to be navigation static. You don't want your AI to think it can walk through the rock, so there's no real reason why you wouldn't. But there are instances where you might have something that's batch static but not navigation static, or vice versa. But for now, I'm just going to click just that one option and make everything static for these two selected game objects. Trying to think if there's anything that should be set. Probably not. I mean, you can change it as you're working and go back and rebake. So I've done that selection. I'm just going to click on bake, and it's going to start exporting tiles. As you'll see, it's a simplified mesh of the geometry that's on the in the scene. Shouldn't take too long, hopefully. Yeah, there you are. So you see in blue because we are on the navigation tab. If I move off, disappears, but just on the navigation tab it shows you the nav mesh, and there's that kind of hole in the nav mesh because these are set as static. Actually, hey, while I'm here, I'll show you what would happen if I said no, it's not navigation static. So i.e. when you're baking, ignore those rocks. Just baking again. It's quite a long bake because we're dealing with a terrain. Terrains have got a lot of tiles. So yeah, so these are not navigation static, so an AI will just think it can walk right through. It's not created a hole. So let's backtrack and bake again. You can keep working as it's baking, thankfully, in the background. So we've got our third person controller. We've got an AI, and an AI needs a target. It needs to kind of decide, right, where am I heading to? It now got a navigation mesh. I can walk around it. It helps it kind of, let's say, pathfind, but you still need to tell it where am I heading. So make things super simple. I'm just going to drag our player into the target. Let's press play and you'll see what I mean. So where's our AI? select him, press F. Oh, he's in the water and he's doing some weird stuff. So I'll tell you why. We undo. So he started off here, so he's kind of at a little bit of a limb already. So your starting point for your AI is pretty. It's important because it's its starting point. So let me move him closer to us. Yeah, so he was here and he tried to get into the water and kind of got a bit lost. I'm just going to move him over there. F to move closer. So everything's a bit dark, it's really hard to see. These options up here, just on the scene tab, is useful. Lights, I can untick the light, so the lighting in the scene view is not being rendered. Other things that are useful for that, so what kind of view you're getting. Currently we're shaded, you could decide to go just wireframe or shaded wireframe. That can be useful if you're working on complex geometry. So yes, and not seeing the lighting in a dark scene is useful. Right, let me move this guy a bit closer to us. Right, now and it's the starting point of an AI is important. If you have him too far off, like off the ground, he won't find the nav mesh. And remember, this nav mesh is kind of is a real thing. And also I can see that it's slightly off the ground, and that's to do with this. That kind of helps settle the, if you tick in advance to just tick height mesh, it'll make things, it'll take a little bit longer to bake, but it'll make it slightly better. They're not perfect nav meshes, and a few tricks that you can take to make things a bit better. But for now I'm just gonna botch it slightly. These settings should ideally be the same size as your players, because it's expecting to know what the agent radius and height are. And the other thing to bear in mind, I'll just press play and you'll see what I mean. So there's our guy. Yeah, actually he's doing pretty well, but he's coming right up to us and he's just not stopping. So we've got a couple of pretty useful settings. Sometimes you'll get an AI that's kind of just hanging in midair, and it's as if it just can't find the ground. What you're looking for there is ground check distance in the third person character, so that's how far off the ground it's able to look down essentially. So if you've got an agent that's hanging in the air, increase that ground check distance, but ours actually currently is okay, and I think it's because I've got the height, the advanced height mesh setting turned on. But the thing that it is doing is it's going right in the face of the player, so I'm just going to increase the stopping distance so it doesn't get quite so close. Okay, and here he comes, and you can see now he's stopping much closer, and we're his targets here. Wherever we go, he's just going to follow us. And you can, I guess, archetypal zombie game, you can spawn these guys and they'll be kind of heading towards you across the land. So that's all good. I haven't saved for ages. Now, is there anything else that I haven't done? I'll stop here. I think that's probably a good point for today. Then tomorrow I'll just do a little bit of scripting, I guess, and talk about colliders, triggers, and scripting motion, and also using the animator. So I haven't really shown you any of that, but you're using it without realizing. So if I select the third person controller and I showed you the component, the animator's got essentially the equivalent of a scriptable object. It's a kind of internal component called an animation controller, which is what you're seeing here. It's essentially a graphical finite state machine. And I go into play mode, you can see it. So currently we're grounded, and then I jump, I go airborne, and then crouch. I think I can make my character crouch by going close to the rock. Or if I move the rock, actually you can do it in, I think I was doing this yesterday. So F to get to it. It won't let me because it's literally is marked as static. I've clicked that flag and the engine is not going to let me move it. Guess I can just add a cube on the fly. Maybe not. I just not. Yeah, I'm not in the way. There he is. So it's going to dynamically recognizing the collision and then forcing the state machine into a crouching mode. Stop, and everything that I added in plane mode disappears, as I mentioned. Right, definitely a good time to stop. I'll catch you tomorrow.